Let me call up the gentleman for our next panel. We're excited to have them with us today. Bruno Lafont, the co-chairman of the board of directors at LafargeHolcim.
You're in the middle.
Come on down. Carlos Pascual, who is a fellow at the Center on Global Energy Policy and the former United States ambassador to Mexico and Ukraine. And also recently the senior advisor to the U.S. Secretary of State on Global Energy Diplomacy. And we're also very pleased to have John Danilovich, who is the Secretary General of the International Chamber of Commerce. Thanks for being with us. This panel is also another really timely one because a lot of what we've heard discussed during the conference over the last 2 days has to do with how the private sector can push policy and political outcomes to really sort of speed this move toward a low-carbon world, but more importantly, how to keep that momentum going. And Carlos, actually, maybe I could start with you. You have, for many, many years, been involved in energy policy in different parts of the world. Tell me whether you think that at this point that the geopolitical momentum exists for the Paris Agreement to succeed, but more importantly, what are the risks going forward? Because there are a number of risks.
Liz, thank you very much. To be able to address that question and to look at the role that industry plays, I think it's useful to take a step back for a second and understand the change nature of the Paris Agreement, because it's a phenomenal innovation in public policy. For the history of climate change negotiations, we always ask the question, what's the ideal path to be able to achieve reductions in carbon? And we can never get a solution because it meant that there had to be a compromise between developed countries and developing countries on who was going to take the cuts into decarbonization. And what this agreement did was it asked the question, what can you do? And it asked all countries to do it. And that's what got the response of being able to bring everybody together so that you had 190 countries coming together and unanimously supporting this agreement. I don't know if Florence Toubiana is in the room, the French climate change negotiator. She was one of the fundamental architects of that process. She's speaking on the next panel, and everybody should give her a huge hand when she comes because it couldn't have happened without people like her playing the role. Now, the next stage of what's going to happen is that for a period of time, we're going to unfortunately find ourselves in a two-gap world. And the first gap is between that which countries pledged for 2030, what are called their nationally determined contributions, and what they actually do. And the reason that there's going to be a gap is that this process happened very quickly. There weren't commercial strategies behind those pledges. And so there's going to be a gap in performance. And then there's going to be a gap between those 2030 targets that they pledged and a 2-degree pathway. And we need to figure out how to close that. And in doing that, one of the challenges that we have to address is how to do this without reawakening the geopolitical debate that we had previously that put developed countries and developing countries at ends. And this is where industry comes in. And I'll just say 2 quick things that we can come back to in more detail if we can to set the context. One of the critical issues is what's the approach that's taken to achieving decarbonization targets? And we've seen the debate and discussion happening over the last day, where some have said that if it's zero carbon, it's good and anything else should be excluded. And the alternative approach that's been raised is if you have a given decarbonization target, what's the most cost-effective way to be able to achieve that solution? And my prejudice, which you can tell from my answer, is what is the integrated systems approach that gets you to that answer? Because in the end, if you have the most cost-effective solutions, they have a greater chance of being commercially viable and for them to be actually implemented. The second issue with industry is, can we find cost-effective alternatives that can compete with coal? Fadi Barol did a fantastic job yesterday of differentiating coal from other resources, but particularly focusing on Asia. Because if we can't solve this problem in India, Indonesia, Vietnam, Southeast Asia, then we can't actually get to the 2-degree target. It just is scientifically impossible to be able to do. And in the end, when you have 1.2 billion people in the world that don't have access to electricity, the question that they're going to ask is, can you do this in a way that is cheaper? And that's where the challenge to industry comes in, of how do you come together with real industrial, commercial propositions combined with financial options, and when necessary, adjusted for public policy solutions that get you to an outcome. But that outcome has to be local, because unless you can actually focus it and target it to a place where you can demonstrate that you can generate electricity at a cheaper price, then it doesn't become a real solution. And that's where I think industry can be a key driver. And if industry can play that role, it can play a critical role in facilitating the broader geopolitical challenge that we have in front of us of keeping countries together and on track.
Well, John, as the head of the ICC, you have a bird's eye view on just how well industry is playing that role. How far ahead is industry, or maybe looking at the flip side, how far behind?
Thank you. Carlos was very right to point out that inevitably it goes with the territory that we are going to have a great challenge in trying to grapple with the implementation of all the structures that need to be put in place with regards to the Paris Agreement. It's not going to be easy. Nobody ever remotely said that it was going to be easy. There are a number of things which we're trying to cope with at the International Chamber of Commerce with regards to trade facilitation, with regards to tariff reductions, with regards to rationalization of tax structures, as well as general trade policies that will facilitate the long process that will take us to arrive at the destination that we need to arrive at. With the 1.2 million, 17 billion, 17% of the world population that does not have access to electricity, with the 2.9 billion of the world population that don't have access to clean cooking. Those two simple parameters, electricity and clean cooking, make it clear of what stands before us in terms of coming to grips with these things. The International Chamber of Commerce, with our trade policy promotion, with our Trade Matters campaign, is doing all that we can to bring these issues to the forefront of governments so that together business can work closely with government in finding the solutions in the areas that I've mentioned: tax, tariffs, trade facilitation, border, general controls that are necessary, general efficiencies that need to be built into the system so that business and society can deal with the challenges that we have.
Well, Bruno, I mean, as basically sort of the only businessman on this panel right now, talk to us a little bit about how your company has tried to meet those challenges. LafargeHolcim, one of the world's largest cement makers, obviously very active in the construction business, is a very heavy energy use industry. You all have also set your own targets, but how are you able to actually sort of move ahead in terms of meeting those, and where are you falling short, where you could improve?
So thank you for the invitation. So it's very practical. The first thing when you are an industrial company is to measure. Is to measure what you do, to measure what your impact is, and then to work on actions to mitigate, So we started to commit ourselves on the CO2 emissions reductions already for 15 years. And we achieved almost 26% CO2 emissions reductions per ton of cement produced. How did we do that? We did that just by changing the formula of our product, adjusting it, making sure that we don't spend too much on energy, and trying to work on the mix of our energy. The mix of our energy, we are consuming fuel and we are consuming power. On fuel, what we can do is to substitute fossil fuels with waste. And today, globally, in over 90 countries, 60% are emerging countries, almost 15% already achieved, but we should do much more. To give you one example, in Europe, we achieved 36%. But we don't see why we could not achieve 90% maybe one day in Europe. So that is working hard at starting to collect waste, to work with governments, by putting in place the regulations which are making the landfilling, more expensive than to bring the waste to the cement plant. And to make it happen not only in Europe or in the most developed countries where cement consumption is more stable, but in emerging countries where the biggest amount of construction is going to happen. And so that is a big, big thing. Another thing we are doing is to work on our technologies. But their technology of cement of today is the cheapest that we have found. And the cheapest means if you want to reduce CO2, there are some ways, but it is much more expensive. And that is where we believe that carbon pricing could be a way. And that is why the industry is also looking for signals which are stable, which are allowing for long-term decisions, for risk-taking, so that we can not just put in place or implement the existing technology we know, but maybe to look for new technologies. The last point I want to say is that after doing that, we say we reduce the negative impact, but can we do something more for our customers? And there we are providing a lot of stuff for construction. How can we contribute to make cities more energy efficient, to make buildings more carbon neutral? And there we have started in our company to invest into research in concrete, to invent concrete which can contribute to solutions for construction and for buildings where they are more insulated, where they are lighter, where they are more durable, and it is starting to happen. But it happens very slowly. Why? Because the construction chain is made of many, many different actors. And to answer your last point, which I believe is very, very important, how to find cheap solution, we have started for several years to work on affordable housing. 1 to 2 billion people have no decent home today. And in emerging countries, the key question is how can we propose solutions for decent and sustainable homes, which means at the same time energy efficient and less costly than what we are doing today. And there we are also researching, and we have developed until now 24 projects in 24 different countries, but we are not at the end. It is the beginning, and we hope that all this, helped by an acceleration, by more cooperation between governments and business, can help also. Last thing I want to say is that our company has played a role in the last 15 years to engage the other players in the industry by creating something which is called a type of sectoral approach, which is now recognized to have produced very positive impacts by forcing ourselves to measure, to recommit, and to report. And that is now covering all the continents.
So greater transparency, but on something that you just said, the both of you just were talking about that a lot of construction is going to be booming, especially in the emerging markets. Carlos, you raised a concern earlier that if at the end of the day we're not able to significantly reduce carbon output in the emerging markets, that the overall goal of COP could be compromised. I mean, elaborate on that concern.
So one part of the world in particular, in Asia, India, Indonesia, Vietnam, and some of the other Southeastern Asian countries are increasing their use of coal at a very rapid rate. And if we're going to achieve the 2-degree target, we're going to have to provide an alternative where those countries have another cost-effective way to produce electricity and energy. And so it brings us back into this practical question of what are the tools that you can use to do that? And you can improve the benefit stream, and to improve the benefit stream, you can have R&D, you can have technology, you can eliminate barriers to trade that allow for better technologies to cross barriers. You can increase the cost of high carbon alternatives like coal, so imposing a price on carbon or creating limits on particulate matter can be part of the equation. You can reduce financing costs, and just in the discussions that we've had today with Aqua Capital, with KK Chen discussing it yesterday, the approaches that they've taken in getting access to capital in Chinese markets and bringing it to and making it available at longer periods of time of finance. If you think about it, you have a capital investment. All of your capital costs are up front. So if you can change the cost of capital, you can radically affect the cost competitive of those investments. And it's those sorts of issues that we're at a stage right now of how do we bring them together in places that have high trajectory of coal use so that we can actually provide alternatives.
You know, there are two areas that come to mind that you've touched upon with regards to research and development. We're going to need to double or triple our investment in our activities in research and development to achieve these targets. Secondly, with regards to trade, global trade in environmental goods, particularly with regards to wind turbines and solar energy, they're presently in some areas 45% tariff on these investments, and those have to be dropped, if not eliminated. It's a huge barrier to increasing alternatives to coal, not only in the areas of Indonesia, India, Southeast Asia, but worldwide. If there are tariff barriers to environmental development with regards to alternative sources of energy, wind and solar, then we won't be able to make the progress that we need.
Bruno, I mean, for you, basically, how do you mentioned, you know, just in passing that obviously sort of, you know, the regulatory regime needs to be sort of stable for businesses as well moving forward. What do you see as a risk right now in the regulatory regime moving forward? What, in your view, as the head of this company or one of the heads of this company, could be improved to help you move even further?
So I think the issue with climate change is a huge transformation which might have very positive impact if it is well managed. And it's the same for companies. If you want to transform your company, you need to prepare, to anticipate, and you have to start early because it takes time. So, and here it is not for a company alone to transform itself, it's for the world, for the countries, and so on. So, and the way to look at it and the way to approach it must be at the same time a little bit academical, so using the technologies and things and using planning instruments, but also pragmatic. That means it is also you know, experimentation, which is quite important. And so the question is a scale, and the question is a speed. The biggest issue for me is the speed of implementation of the carbon pricing and the speed of convergence between the different systems, and the way we can reconcile sometimes contradictions between the goal for sectors. It's true that the energy sector needs a more rapid increase in carbon pricing than the industry sector. So, and sometimes the interests are not exactly the same. And so we have to find solutions. But it's true that it's both the commitments of the different players, the measurement systems, and the will of cooperation between government and business, which will make this happen in a formal way. So what is positive is that we have already good examples. What we see that EU is already an experience and is starting to review its ETS system. You have seen the last decisions made by Canada about carbon pricing. It's interesting. We see that China is going fast at putting that in place. The question will be the level playing field, you know, and the distortions which may happen between sectors and across regions. And we have to make sure that this is happening in a smooth way.
You know, we're addressing something that has not been addressed before. And we're trying from each of our perspectives and from all of your perspectives, all of you who have made arriving at this date, entry into force, possible, who were here last year in Paris, throughout the whole process, particularly September, October, November, December, we're now back here again. This process is being addressed. And that's what I think is critical for all of us to remember, that whether it's government, private sector, business specifically, all of these matters of convergence with regards to speed, scale, will, commitment, we're all expressing that. We're all trying to grapple with the definition of what it means, how to do it at the right time, how much to do. And that's in and of itself is an achievement. So not that we should by any means congratulate ourselves, we haven't reached anything yet, but we're certainly addressing the question of how to get there, and I think that's important.
You know, yesterday, one of the things that came up in a number of the panels was digitalization and the importance of information technology, and we have to bring that back into any discussion of industry because it is so transformative. And we live in a world where there are sensors on everything. And I'm sure that you have them in your plant, and I'm sure that they're giving you information on what the optimal mix is, how to maximize your use of fuel. And it has become so pervasive that this flow of information has become a fundamental tool to actually creating efficiency. And that's the other piece of this equation that has to work is how do you take as much energy out of the system, not just what you're putting into it. And we have opportunities that are emerging in this area that we've just never had before because we have technologies that we have never had before. And so that also has to be part of the equation that we have to factor in of how do we make it, how do we create the incentives for businesses to be able to take advantage of it. You do because it saves you money, but then how do you create electricity distribution systems that take advantage of those incentives for savings and change the way cost models and business models function so that actually saving energy becomes part of the industrial and the business model to be able to achieve low-cost solutions.
And when we were talking earlier, you gave actually an interesting example of how the technology is there, but also of how policy needs to, be able to drive a further implementation of that. You live in Mexico. You were talking about how, basically the government implemented a policy that encouraged electric cars, and just mention that anecdote if you wouldn't mind.
So in Mexico, between May and July of every year, there's an inversion period, very high levels of pollution. One of the ways that the government has dealt with this is that it's created alternate days of driving based on license plate numbers. When it gets really bad, you have 2 license plate numbers, and some people can actually find that for 3 to 4 days a week, they can't use their cars. But the exception that they gave was if you have a hybrid, you can drive on any day. Yep. And the demand for hybrid cars just suddenly shot up in Mexico.
Right.
So, yesterday somebody talked about the implicit price of carbon. That's an implicit price of carbon. Mm-hmm. They've basically said that you may pay a higher price for a hybrid vehicle. It's a price on carbon, but as a result of that, you're going to be able to get to use your vehicle. Yeah. And those kinds of public policy solutions are going to be key to the overall set of package of solutions that we have to have.
That's a great illustration. Let me open it up to the audience for questions. If there are any, please raise your hand. And if there aren't at this time, I actually did want to ask you all another question quickly. One of the other things that we talked about, and we started off this conversation by discussing geopolitical risks, and I asked this question of the EU Energy Commissioner who was with us earlier today, but I would love to hear your all's take on this. Basically, sort of at this time last year, we couldn't have imagined that this sort of black swan would sort of fly up in amidst, the celebration that we're having today of the implementation of COP21, and that is with respect to what is the election that's going on in the United States. Not asking you to comment on who should win or anything, but again, we are in a situation where we have either during this debate not heard the candidates really discuss climate policy, or we've also heard one of the candidates suggest that if they were to win, that they would take the United States out of COP. How would that sort of bleak scenario, which we hope wouldn't happen, but you can't rule too much out these days, how would that change the playing field and change the equation of what you all have been talking about here?
Well, one of the things I can start with is that there has been an extensive discussion of climate issues in these elections, and it was in the Democratic primary. And if you recall, the issue of climate was actually very central to the debate between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. and it actually pushed a much greater focus on climate because of the interests of youth in the United States. It has been silent in the general election, essentially because of that independent voter group where climate can play potentially either way, and that is going to make or break this election. And it's instructive in and of itself. But I wouldn't say that there's been silence on it. And if you look at Hillary Clinton's website, there's a very defined position on climate. If the United States does not play on these issues of climate reduction and decarbonization, there's a very great risk that the whole package of agreement begins to fall apart. China immediately falls out because they're not going to move forward on something where the United States is not taking a parallel role. India becomes questionable. If you have then 3 of the largest emitters of the world that are not participating in the package, then you don't have a package. So having the United States here is absolutely key. Keeping the alliance of the United States and China as the 2 largest emitters of moving forward and being aggressive and implementing their commitments is fundamental to success under the agreement.
I see you nodding your head.
No, strong point. I couldn't agree more emphatically. The reality is that we presently have the 3 major emitters, the European Union, the US, and China, who have ratified the agreement, the accord. 87 of 197 countries have done so. That may not sound like much, but it's actually huge, because usually these type of accords take a long period of time to have substantial agreement. The Rome Statute, the non-proliferation treaties have all taken a long time to get even to that number where we already are. There's no question that if there is how do we not politicize this conversation? Probably not possible.
Right.
Certainly the Democrats have made a very strong position, I think, which can be strongly supported in general. I think there would actually be a huge uproar in the United States were there to be a president who would seek to withdraw from the COP21 agreement. I just can't imagine that being, although he has certainly said that, and I think it's frankly reprehensible. I think it would be really staggering if the U.S. were, under any circumstances, to reconsider its commitment.
As the European on the panel and also as the businessman on the panel at both levels, what are your thoughts about that?
What's interesting is that if you look back, I remember Copenhagen. So it was not a great result, but in fact it created awareness. And for many companies, it started to become a priority. And when it becomes a priority with measurement, and you start to follow. With Paris, you have a much greater result, which is the commitment of governments and countries. So if COP22 helps, to accelerate the implementation, means putting in place measurements, putting in place a way of reporting, and verification would be a fantastic progress, because if not, the risk is that there is always something more important and more urgent, and it is one of the most important things we need to do. So I think exactly as it is the case for companies, for governments, if they put in place instruments, measurements, and ways to follow, it will be an enormous improvement.
So this could still move ahead somewhat, even if we had a slightly disastrous scenario of the United States deciding that they don't want to participate.
I think yes, because you get the pressure of the people on climate change. You can see that in emerging countries also.
I think one of the things, and it's an important balancing point to put on the table, that moving toward lower carbon society in many parts of the world is commercially attractive. Aqua talked about how you're making money off of renewable energy production. Some indicated that they're not there yet, but that process is beginning. In the United States, for example, the Clean Power Plan is currently held up in the Supreme Court, but 40, or I would say, let me put it this way. There are 14 states that have supported implementing the Clean Power Plan. They're going to implement it. There are 27 states that have challenged it in the court. Of those 27 that challenged it, 21 are actually going to achieve the target. And the reason they're going to do it is that there are lower carbon fuels, and in particular right now in the United States, gas, that provide an alternative to coal. my point is that there are commercial solutions that are bringing industry to lower carbon solutions because technology is getting cheaper, lower cost carbon options are getting cheaper. And so that's part of what we need to push, is that drive within industry to act on commercial incentive, which is going to be the critical factor moving us in the right direction.
Well, let's hope we do keep moving that in that direction. Thank you very much for being with us. Let's have a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you for an interesting discussion. Let me invite my colleague Adam Bryant to come up to the stage for our next panel.